Sorry. Okay. That all sorted. Again, I'm not squeamish necessarily on a person to person level about having my face out there. It's just, raw internet is that one thing I'd kind of like to keep a little bit of a barrier between.
For sure, especially because of what you're exploring, right?
Yeah, it's actually it's interesting, and maybe we can go into this, is that I finally had the first negative negative like crossover between podcast world and real world, where essentially I recently got married, and one of my, you know, he and I have a strained relationship now, but one of my long-term friends
Hmm.
basically found out about the podcast at the wedding, and, just to use a colloquial term, just absolutely flipped his shit, like just lost it. And admittedly, part of it is because he's a disinfo researcher at a big school in the Northeast, right? So he's kind of primed for that. But I don't know. It only takes one or two of those for you to get
Spooked.
paranoid. I will say, there are some other people who, because I'm not. There's nothing I've said on my podcast that I don't believe. It's just there's a time and place, right? But I will say, the interview you and I did for my channel has been getting passed around, and I've gotten exceptional feedback on it. People really, really liked that episode, including people in my personal life.
Hmm. What was it our chemistry or?
I don't know. They basically just thought, the conversation I got multiple times was, I'm not sure who is interviewing who,
Hmm.
which is kind of a funny conversation,
Yeah,
or a
welcome to a
funny,
Benjamin Boyce interview. Yeah.
yeah, right. But generally, and this is what I thought was interesting, and what I enjoyed about our conversation was just the fact that it went oddly spiritual, in a way that I think neither of us were expecting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how have you been? I know we haven't spoken directly in a couple weeks.
No, yeah, I'm just going through a major life event change. So you know, private life is going whoosh. Public life is pretty stable, though. You have your persona and then your personhood. Um, so it's pretty novel what's going on. And yeah, so a new, I guess, horizon of opportunity is opening up to me. And so I'm kind of just rapidly acclimating to that and reconsidering like what I'm doing online. Like I always go through a process every year, at least once a year, maybe uh, 1.5 times a year, I go through a process where I don't know what I'm doing anymore, and I start to
Hmm.
reconsider, like on kind of some sort of processing, like some conscious level, like what am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing? Who am I? And not in an existential way, but in a professional way, right? Which I think allows me to change course, or at least allows me to prepare to explore different avenues or go in different directions. Um, so as I've gone through the past 6 years, and I'm coming up on my 6 year anniversary of my first Evergreen video, um, I've been able to go from, the Evergreen story to, gender issues to various different political domains. And that's how I kind of eventually gravitated towards your neck of the woods, which is, what would it be? What would you consider you and what you're exploring to be?
I don't know. I would consider myself very much kind of an unapologetic creature of the right. I can't deny that. But I
Hmm.
think that a lot of people, and you and I are kind of coming at this from different angles, different cultures, have kind of realized that the standard options as presented to us through my entire life, through your entire life, well, it's a limited tool set. And the problems we're facing, I mean, it's like someone handed us three hammers, and it's like, all right, well, you need to make a vase. And those three hammers are almost completely useless for that. And so there's formed this community of people who are kind of genuinely interested in like solving these kind of great problems. And the problem with that is that we've kind of realized that, wait a minute, like there's some things that we've been lied to about, the kind of core facts about how people work, kind of like the way that normal humans have operated. And so there's this process, and I think a lot of us are going through it, of kind of pulling at the string. and hopefully you don't unravel the whole sweater, right? If you can forgive me for mixing metaphors here, but
No,
there is
no,
something
no.
to be said for the fact that I think that there's this group of genuine seekers, and there's a lot of different terms that have been used for it. I tend not to attach labels to myself just because I've said this before. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not finished yet. And
Hmm.
so kind of in the
Have you
process
even
of finding
begun?
out, well, I think so, just because it's
Okay.
like, well, okay, I'm talking to as many people as I can. I'm asking questions and trying to listen for interesting answers. But what I will say, probably the best term for me, if you want to talk about ideological lineage, is that I am from the kind of the mold bug Curtis Yarvin diaspora. This was a group of people who, are obviously kind of, if you really go back to it, kind of from a post-libertarian sphere, of
Mm,
basically people saying like, all right, like we want freedom. We want, a way in which people can live, good lives without this kind of like overwhelming, state force over top of them. And I think a lot of
yeah.
people would say that sounds good. But what Moldbug and a lot of people, myself included, kind of realized is like, well, wait a minute. Like, one, libertarians never win anything, you know, and two, it doesn't seem like the tools set forth for us, the way that you make change, the way that you know, you tell your overlords you would like to be ruled. It doesn't seem like that works. And so if that doesn't work, right? If protesting, if letting people know, getting 50 plus 1% doesn't seem to work, well, it's like, well, what are our other options? And because I think that the vast majority of people look at the way that, the society in the US or even kind of globally is trending and say, well, I don't like that. That doesn't seem to be producing good outcomes. And so given that, I think that whatever you want to say, that group of people who look at the future and say that doesn't look so good, like how are we going to avoid this iceberg? I don't know. That's a very long, rambly answer, but that's
Hmm.
kind of who I would consider
Hmm.
myself allied with.
Yeah. So I'm going through, is it Alexander Dugin? I think it's Alexander Dugin,
Mm-hmm.
but Dugin is a Russian philosopher. He's been associated with Putin, but he's just a philosopher. He's a pretty interesting guy. I'm going through his fourth political theory, which is really fascinating because it provides a really deep critique of liberalism. And as an American growing up, in the I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and then I've been an adult throughout this millennia. I Liberalism is what I swim in. Like progressive liberalism is all it's just always already assumed. And even in the dissident sphere, the dissident right, where you have Rush Limbaugh, I guess, kind of poking holes or mocking the libs or owning the libs, that duopoly or that monopoly that the Republicans and the Democrats have. There's no real questioning of the foundations of what's going on. And so, with regard to Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, and then all the people who, in his wake, have been kind of pulling at these strings. One thing that I feel is there's a tremendous amount of energy around questioning progress, just trying to say, okay, what is progress? Is progress good? Is that an assumption of history? Is it an assumption of time? And Dugin gets into this Heideggerian kind of contemplation of time, and the liberal order has a certain sort of telos to it, a certain sort of direction to it that is particular to a time and a place and a people, and that it's trying to universalize itself, trying to globalize itself, is because it assumes that it is the one true way path. To even question that it's heretical. And I can see why you would want, and a lot of people in your sphere need to be anonymous to a certain degree, because it is very heretical to even pull at those strings. Because once you pull those strings, then you have to contend with questions about equality, questions about the difference between different ethnicities, different sorts of cultures, the difference between men and women, and how far can we allow that to, be questioned. Even just the question, the difference between man and woman, nobody really wants to. It becomes more and more politically correct the more radically you question the differences. So liberals want to, or pre-trans rights liberals want to kind of go back a little bit, but they don't want to go back too far to where we say, men should be this way, women should be that way. We don't want to go there, but we still want to say they are distinct, right? So again, that's a long, rambly answer to kind of just lay out the field of conversation.
No, definitely. And I think that a lot of red state Americans, right? People from areas that are, in the American context considered conservative, view the term liberal in very much like a Rush Limbaugh sense, right? The liberal Democrats, to kind of use a term from another age. But I think that we have to be honest about the fact, and I'm a part of this tradition, right?
Yeah.
That we're kind of all liberals of one type or another. That your big two channels of thought, at least traditionally speaking in American politics, were Jefferson on one hand and Hamilton on the other, right? You can view this, the one which is kind of a more like aristocratic, states' rights based, but still incredibly liberal, or, the kind of like centralized, non-federalized version of, like United States liberalism. And again, I think that this is one of the interesting things about when you hear a discussion about the far right. The far right can mean, any number of things. And it's oftentimes, attached to, people like the Boogaloo Boys, right? Who are essentially like ultra constitutionalists, right? Which is kind of odd in a historical context because you're right. Well, wait a minute. These guys would basically be the Antifa of 1870, which is what essentially our founding fathers were. They were rich kids who were kind of up on the, the new like cutting edge of, like left wing ideology. And I don't say that in a punitive way, but I think that we need to be honest about, where we're coming from. And I think that's been especially interesting in my spheres, kind of the right wing on YouTube has been going and kind of looking outside of, the immediate present when it comes to politics and philosophy. Because one of the things that I think really harms conservative Americans is that they are told both by cultural leaders and in many cases their own leaders that, your instincts, your feelings can only be channeled into essentially like conservatism Inc., to steal Paul Gottfried's term, to Killing Crazy Horse, ghostwritten by, Bill O'Reilly, or to conservative talk radio. And there's in fact a rich tradition, an intellectual tradition that goes back much farther than just see thing in news, don't like it. Like the gosh darn, liberal Democrats want to take away your gas stoves or you're this or you're that. This kind of like,
or put a
lowercase
fake woman on
reactionary
your Bud Light.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, and these things can be irritating, but they're not necessarily substantive content. But if you go back, right, you're like, wait a minute, other people have felt like this. There's real legitimate thought here who have questioned things that because both the left and the right in America are downstream of, big L capital or classical liberalism, these are not up for discussion. And again, it's like that analogy I said of pulling the string out from the sweater where you're like, well, wait a minute. I never thought about this. I never thought about this. I never thought about this.
Yeah.
And on one hand, that's kind of scary, right? Because you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like I'm kind of, I'm sawing the branch that I'm sitting on. Mm-hmm. But if you kind of get this bug in you, which I think you have and I have, and a lot of people have here too, which is like, I actually want to know, I want to find out, then you kind of can't stop yourself. And so again, if we're kind of drawing, in group, out group, I would consider my friends, the people who can't stop themselves.
So what are some of the, can we drill down into one of the assumptions or one of the alternative assumptions?
So actually a really easy one is democracy, right? So democracy is, there's this, and I mean capital D democracy, right? Which is kind of this sacred idea. And what you'll see is if you were to only read essentially like, shall we say, legacy media, right? You would read a lot of things like, oh, there's a protest in XYZ country. Actually, the protests in Georgia, the country of Georgia, are a really good example for this, right? Protests in Georgia, pro-democracy, challenging this bill that would harm democracy, right? In both contexts, it's pro or for. And then you read it and you're like, wait a minute, The Georgian parliament wanted to pass a bill that would throw out NGOs, so essentially Western political organizations. Now that's anti-democratic. You're like, well, wait, why is it? Because that's decreasing effectively the political power of native Georgians, right? Mm-hmm. By allowing American and British and European political interference in their politics. But it is anti-democratic, big D. And what you learn is essentially that really democracy doesn't actually mean practically the literal dictionary definition. It's a word used by power. And so this is a trap that a lot of conservatives, right-leaning people, and kind of what I consider like the anti-woke crowd fall into, which is they say, look, you're not being consistent. And the problem is, and this is a very like postmodern critique, is that the power doesn't care about consistency. They don't have to.
No.
And so my point in that is not to say, therefore, democracy bad, but my point is to say, like, look at this concept. This concept is not what you were taught in civics class, excuse me. And so that's like one level of critique, right? That democracy as it is described to us is not necessarily, one-to-one with what we see in the news. Another one, and this is a deeper critique, is from people like famous Austrian economist Hans-Hermann Hoppe, right? Who essentially, he says, well, all right, if we actually believe the promises of democracy, right? That democracy will increase personal freedom, it will limit war, it'll make people accountable. Is that true? And what he found in his book, which is kind of a collection of essays, Democracy, the God That Failed, he's like, look, this isn't true. When we see the rise of democracy, we don't see the state shrinking. We don't see violence shrinking. If anything, far from it. And the example he uses, right, is the French Revolution. Right? So the French Revolution, the franchise, it goes from being an absolute monarchy to some level of, there's a franchise. Well, and what happens? Well, the French army goes from being, a small professional force to the levée en masse. Right? It's this massive force. The whole country becomes politicized because they have the vote. They have that little nugget of political power, and now they're militarized. And so there's a line of critique that basically says, once you have foisted politics on everyone, they are a part of the state. They are a target. They are a part of the machine. And so this is kind of another line of attacking quote unquote democracy, which is that basically democracy is kind of tied to this idea of total war. And if you look at kind of the crumbling of kind of like ritualized European combat, because obviously, and I'm not trying to say that democracy is the cause of all evils. Humans are eminently capable of genociding, murdering, raping each other. That's not my point. But within the kind of closed system of European powers, wars had gotten, again, relatively as much as they can, safe. Because again, these political entities were controlled by families. And if you're a family, right, you really don't want to leave your kids with a ton of debt because they're your kids. This is a family business. And so you can't squander all of the family business's capital on some war unless it really comes down to it. And so again, right, that's another thing where you'd think that democracy would increase, or if you were kind of following like traditional teaching, you would assume that democracy would increase the amount of accountability our leaders have. And if anything, far from it. And so my point is not to say like I am democracy's number one enemy. I'm democracy's number two enemy. I believe that Putin is democracy's number one enemy. But my point is to say that that's one of these threads, right? Democracy as this kind of ultimate good, this kind of like shining beacon that we need to go to forever. That if you kind of examine it, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't all of the promises made haven't been kept. And so what I'm not sitting here saying is, therefore, let's go back to, a Roman style dictatorship or 16th century France. But this is a discussion. This is something up for debate. Yeah. And so democracy is just the first one that popped into my head because I've been reading some Austrian economics. Another one is equality, right? The idea that you can pause equality at one point. This is what we kind of mentioned before when you said, that the kind of like the pre-trans liberals want to go back to kind of this 1990s, conception of how the world worked. Yeah. But if you kind of view equality as this, like ultimate precept, well, why should you stop? Genuinely, why should you? And that's a question that I haven't seen
What do you mean
convincingly.
stop? Like
Well, the
progressing
idea that
towards more like splitting hairs further and going from we're going to eradicate discrimination to we're going to eradicate microaggressions, right?
right
Just
is that
constantly
at
looking for
least right, and maybe I've gotten somewhat, I've maybe gotten somewhat far away from my original point, and forgive me for that. But basically, is is equality, is that something that you can pin, or is it kind of this like wedge that goes on forever?
Mhm.
Because again, and this goes back to kind of like the core critique of democracy, is that
Yeah.
equality is a very difficult thing to say no to. When you can put something with that kind of level of moral weight. And again, and I'm sorry, I feel like I've somewhat overextended myself here, but again, right, it comes back to this idea of like, well, which premises, if we're in a situation, right, where it seems like no one has in the institution of the state, in the academy, has answers, and it seems like everyone is kind of playing with, if you can imagine, if 9 out of 10 inputs are fixed, so this would be things like equality, we can't touch equality. Democracy, you can't touch democracy. We only have that extra 10% that we can change. And it seems like the problems facing us require more than a 10% change.
Hmm.
Then you start to say, well, like, okay, well, what of these previously fixed inputs? Like, what are we going to examine? And once you start doing it, you find a lot of interesting things. And so, sorry, Benjamin, I believe I've gotten kind of well away from our original point, but that's merely what I wanted to say.
Yeah. I think one job or one mission, or one thing that needs to be done is to call things what they are. And so with the word like democracy, if you look at how the Democrats are using the word democracy to justify decreasing democracy, they're saying this election is going to end democracy. If we allow this election, or if the other team wins, we're going to lose democracy. So we need to do everything in our power. They become more and more baldly undemocratic to preserve democracy. So if we just call it what it is, and the project of, I think Yarvin, in one of his earlier essays, brings up this Confucian principle of just calling things what they are. Just say what it is. It's power preserving itself. So power uses equality. We handed the civil rights movement handed the government this mandate to create equality. And so the government, this machine, this Leviathan, just will do anything in the name of equality, even smashing equality, because it has a mandate to do this thing, to produce this certain result or something that approaches the certain result. And once we get to woke times and then anti-woke times, people who had assumed that equality was good, democracy was good, all these things are good, even freedom is a good in and of itself, start to realize that, freedom actually isn't so good, if that means that, people are going to be screwing each other in the streets in the name of freedom or liberation. And democracy isn't all that good if it means that, for a variety of different reasons, it's a cloak of power, and equality being a cloak of power. So just kind of peeking under the veil. And you brought up earlier that, you had triggered somebody who works in disinfo. Like, what is it about this thing called disinfo that is really touchy around certain questions, right? Doesn't that kind of reveal a blind spot in this whole disinformation campaign, or these colleges, these academies, and then the government itself is wanting to defeat disinfo, but it's not actually defeating disinfo. It's trying to strain certain ideas out of discourse, or to really control. It's not about disinformation. It's about controlling the Overton window. It's about controlling acceptable discourse, not so much trying to preserve truth or clarity, but rather
definitely
to police conformity.
And I think that another useful prism to kind of look at this through is protest, right? Which is, if you believe the kind of the standard narrative, right? Which is that protests work because, the people in power see there's a large group of, my constituents who are unhappy.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose my spot. So I will, kneel to the crowd. Right. And obviously in extremis, right? Like when we'll go back to the French Revolution, right? when it gets to that scale, that works, right? When it's literally like, well, if I don't, and obviously it didn't ultimately work for them, but when you literally have, thousands of people with pitchforks outside, they tend to get their way. Not saying that's good, but in kind of
they didn't get their way though. They were promised that they would get their way, but they swapped out one tyranny for another, and it turned out to be a worse tyranny.
Which is another point about history we can get back to later. But what I mean is, obviously, if you get enough people power that does trump, kind of the governing apparatus, right? That in an extreme case, but in the more immediate case, right, within your life or within my life, in kind of the last, we'll just say 100 years of history, it's not necessarily what's happened. So the example I like to use is, okay, do you remember, and I'll ask this to people, do you remember when during the BLM protests, the White House got charged? Because no one does. But there was a massive, riot outside the White House. People were trying to hop the fence into the White House.
Yeah.
That's gone. Why? Well, because it's not particularly useful to keep it around. Like it was kind of the things got outside of what they were, supposed to do. However, right, you look at January 6th, right? And this is kind of this is the new 9/11. This is the seminal event. Like, where were you? And well, you look at those two things and you're like, okay, if we just took this at the most objective level, right? Or even another example is like, how many times has the Capitol been stormed before? Like, I can think of a number of times, right? The Black Panthers even shot up the inside of the Capitol, I believe. My point is, right, a lot of those cases, they matter, right? And on paper, you're like, well, these are the same thing. They attacked a government building. They tried to go into the seat of power. But I mean, have you seen a wanted poster for anyone who tried to storm the White House over George Floyd? I haven't, but I have seen FBI wanted posters in my own town, right, for people involved in, the Jan 6 thing. Yeah. And so you look at that and you're like, okay, well, what's the determining factor, right? These things are, close enough to the same case, right? People challenge government.
Yeah.
But one of them is aligned and one of them is disaligned with capital P power, what they want.
Actual power. Yeah.
And so my point in this is to say that this is one of those things that you're kind of crippling yourself if you don't realize that power has this kind of distorting field, right? It's like gravity, it can change time. And power has this ability to change the application of principles, right? Because if you would have asked, most people in many cases, likely the same people who were sitting on the picket line, over the George Floyd riots, like, well, what are you doing? Like, oh, well, we are protesting for democracy, right? If you would have asked the same people, who are storming the Capitol, what are you here for? Well, I'm protesting for, democracy. We want, the power held to be accountable. This narrative is the same, but right, when it's presented, when it's kind of filtered through the lens of power, well, one of these becomes this kind of like grave threat. And each of these, again, becomes kind of a moral justification. And it doesn't matter that they're not being consistent. They're in charge, they win. And I don't know, to me, and maybe I'm rambling on this, but to me, there's certain points at which there's a discussion, right, between you and me. There's a discussion between people who are kind of engaged in good faith, but there's not necessarily a discussion with power, right? Power does what it wants and justifies it later. And it will use the exact same language to, lift up its allies and oppress its enemies. And so my point is, and this is what you're going back to about what you said about, democracy being kind of a cloak, is that realistically, how is that different from, the Akrona in Russia? How is that different from kind of like supposedly these systems of oppression? When we're talking about how governments used to work, it's like, it's really not. If you cross the state, you'll get punished. If you support the state, you'll get rewarded.
Yes.
The only difference is, like you said, you use that phrase like a shroud or a cloak around power, is that it's not clearly laid out. And so my point is, and this is another, kind of like dividing line, is what is your vision of human nature? Like, do you essentially view that humans are a relative constant, or that they can be made objectively better or worse? Mm-hmm. And to me, obviously there are better and worse societies, but it's kind of a narrow band. People are people. And so when it comes to the way that people organize themselves, we call this politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, it's kind of always the same. That does not mean that the values of those systems are the same, right? That you could say, well, I don't want to exist in a society that participates in, shall we say, something like, the Mesoamerican Empire, mass scale human sacrifice. I think that's bad. Okay, so the discussion that we're having, right, is not necessarily how do humans project power on each other. We'll just say that's a constant. There's always people getting trampled by power. There's always people aligning themselves with it. I would argue we can't fix that. That's kind of how humans are. But, we can see that who's in power, who's in charge, who's making the calls, that does materially matter. Because, I would prefer, the people who say no human sacrifice or the people who say human sacrifice in power, if that makes sense. Sorry, do you see what I'm getting at there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. State that last point again.
So sorry. I view the discussion as not being, will there be coercion, yes or no? Like, will there be state power trampling on people? I view that as a constant of human organization. Like it's kind of neither a moral, or immoral thing. It is simply how it works. Mm-hmm. The decision, the defining factor between societies is effectively what values are being enforced and what is the criteria for friend and enemy of the state. And I would argue that our government has a bad system of criteria for not only who is a friend and enemy, but what is kind of the core organizing principles. And so maybe I've been kind of circuitous, like dancing around that. But to me, that's kind of the core issue up for debate, if that makes sense.
From your point of view, what is the United States? What is the values of the USG, whatever that is, that entity, that huge entity with a bunch of heads on top, but just huge apparatus behind it? Like, what are the values?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because it kind of brings up the point of, well, do the people in charge actually believe what they say? And that's open for debate, right? Because I would make the argument that when it comes to, like certain like shadowy banking players, right? Like for instance, right, you'd say like BlackRock and these corporations that have a great deal of power. I would argue if you really polled the people at the top, they probably don't care about things like ESG, But I will say that I would argue that essentially every society has a state religion, right?
Yes.
That everything has kind of an organizing principle. And this is something, again, going back to our liberal priors, that I think that our liberal forefathers got wrong, is they believed that you could fully drive a line between organizing beliefs, kind of these like theological ideas. You could rule rationally. I don't really think you can. But point is, I would make the argument that if you look at, well, what is sacred in the United States religion, right? Like USG church, I would say things like, one, full and total social equality, right? You could say like and you see this, right, when it comes to certain programs about like uplifting, women or certain minorities, sexual minorities, racial minorities, that should be done everywhere.
Okay, so let me just keep your thought going, but let me just plug into that. It's not necessary. I don't think it's actual state social equality. It's jiggering with social equality. It's lifting and suppressing. It's messing around with equality. I mean, it's using equality as the goal to enact its power. To say we're going to lift up these people and we're going to suppress these people. It's just equality is just again, it's a cloak for it to make friends and enemies, to punish and reward people. But it just enables that connection between power and the population. It's another field of possibility for power to enact itself. It's not the value. It's not the value of equality. It's what equality allows the government to do.
Well, right. That's a fair point. Although I would say that there are cases in which the government's desire to its desire to enforce principle harms its power, right? So for instance, you can make the argument of cases like Afghanistan, right? If you are kind of this Machiavellian, super statesman, Does having girls' schools in a conservative Muslim country that teach Judith Butler feminism, does that make it easier or harder for you to project power? I would argue that makes it harder. But if you view that as kind of a messianic, or not a messianic, like a missionary effort, right? Like promoting a religion, I would argue that that becomes a more rational decision that within that kind of framework. Do you see what I'm getting at?
You're seeking converts, and you're seeking to erode. You're seeking to erode the religion that you're of the place you're occupying, and then install your own. Oh, well, I mean, I guess with postmodernism specifically, its job isn't to install a religion; it's to corrode religions. But it's useful to corrode religions. I don't see it as useful in building religions, but it's still that's a sub point. But I get your point.
Yeah, my direction. So sorry. What I mean to say is that I think that there are decisions made where ideology trumps power. And to me, I think that's what 2020 proves to me. That, for instance, right, if you wanted to say like, all right, like America is a multiracial and multicultural society, right? You would assume that if you wanted to keep that society, kind of like running well, you wanted that generator of economic wealth to keep going. Well, then you kind of say like, all right, well, we don't want people at each other's throats. We want to rule over a peaceful country. Actually, criminal justice is in fact a really great example for this, right? You would expect that there ought to be kind of like safe streets. If you're running a country well. But what we've seen is that essentially like there is, and maybe what happened, which I think we'll never know, is that essentially that like there's a group of people who kind of have the tiger by the tail, that they used this tool to get into power, and now, oh dear God, we can't stop it. Kind of like a sorcerer's apprentice type of situation. Mm-hmm. But I do think that what we're seeing is a case in which kind of like ideology is rampant. It's runaway, and I think that the viewing this as a battle of religions, I think, is a more useful way to look at it. That this isn't a policy decision necessarily where you can say, well, like I've crunched the numbers, you would make plus 3%, good units a year. If you swapped my plan, it's basically this is a theological disagreement. And we're arguing about deeply held, almost non-rational positions, where it's almost like this is good. And you see this all the time, right? When kind of like the ultra rationalists try to say like, if you, I think of that OnlyFans girl turned philosopher, Ayala, yeah. I don't know how to say her name, and she posted this thing, which is like, well, okay, like, why is it wrong to sleep with a dead dog? Like, well, it can't feel pain, it can't consent. And it's like, well, okay, like if you get to that level of abstraction, like, I don't know if I can necessarily give to you a 3-point syllogism as to why it's wrong. Like maybe if you really wanted into it, you could get into epidemiology, like you have, extra chance to contract some brain eating virus. Point is, but I would argue that is effectively like lizard brain disgust. No, like that's just wrong. And I think that a lot of people, especially coming from this, both have this liberal tradition, that you and I are a part of, are kind of uncomfortable with just saying, this is just wrong. Yes. Like I don't have to tell you an argument. I don't have to rationalize. And I'm not saying abandon all reason. That's not my point. But the idea, and this is, the idea that, reason is like, to go back to the French Revolution, right? We can crown reason, use that to replace this kind of like non-syllogistic system of views, right? Replacing, tearing down the church and putting up a harlot, and calling her the goddess reason, enshrining that as the central, like, I guess, like guiding light of our civilization. That doesn't work. I don't know if it ever worked. I don't know if we ever really did it, but certainly now we're not really facing and this goes back to that kind of like remaining 10% of allowable discussion, right? That we're going to need to look at this at a much more fundamental level than policy. Right. And this is why I think that I'm not the biggest Tucker Carlson fan. I don't really watch his show, but the speech that got him canceled, right? The speech that got him yanked from Fox News is a speech which I believe he gave to Heritage, right? Where he essentially said, this is not a policy discussion anymore. This is kind of a deeply, this is evil.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that we have to be honest about is that both halves of this country, whether you want to say anti and pro woke or like whatever that defining like line is, they don't view each other as political enemies. They don't view each other necessarily as, like, oh, it's
We're gonna have a
my
discussion about
neighbors who
this.
vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, my neighbors who vote for Al Gore, or my neighbors who vote for Bush. Although you could probably say that it had already started to set in then. But maybe H.W. Bush would be a better example. That like, did anyone ever say like I stopped talking to my family because they voted for Clinton? Like maybe, if so, I haven't heard about it. Whereas now it really is, it seems like we are, we have these two mutually exclusive religious systems fighting it out. And again, right, that's not something that I think that is easy to discuss within kind of a framework of, liberal policy. And so my point is, I think that's part of the reason why you've seen, a lot of people be kind of unable to classify what's going on, unable to kind of make sense of, the culture war, whatever you want to say it, because it's not necessarily the same type of disagreements we were having, 50, 70, 100 years ago. These are two completely divergent cultures, two completely divergent religions. And so again, right, like I think it's wise to say like, all right, we're in kind of territory we haven't been in a while. We're essentially at a religious conflict, and like,
yeah,
well, we need better tools to understand that. And so that's why I think, a lot of people have been picking their head up and kind of like examining, well, one, what led us here, and two, like if we're fighting this religious war, like when did it start, and two, like why are we here?
Fighting over?
Yeah, exactly. What are we fighting over?
Yeah.
So I hope that kind of makes sense.
Footnote to go just back a little bit because I want to say it out loud so I can think about this further. But rationality inherently has no content. Rationality does not have any content. And so when people appeal to rationality, they're actually appealing to their values and then putting rationality on top of their values. Rationality, or even liberalism, classical liberalism, is a mode of communication. It doesn't say anything about what's being communicated. So the founding fathers had a bunch of assumptions, and you see that here and there in quotes like this. We built this system that is inherently to be run by moral people. This will only ever work. I think it was Adams or one of those guys said this would only work with people who fear God and who behave correctly. Like once that is gone, like the system of rationality can serve any given modus operandi. So we need to peel back we need to stop appealing to rationality as though it is something. It is either a harlot or a saint, but rationality is just the mode of dress of it. So I just want to say
and I feel like a useful example in this, and I'm a Protestant Christian, and it's become kind of fashionable in certain circles to basically say like, oh, progressivism is merely a Protestant Christian heresy. And there's probably, let's be honest, some truth to that. But one of the kind of core ideas baked into Luther was this idea of taking kind of a rational approach to faith. Like, well, okay, what makes sense, given this text? And I think that we can see the limitations of human reason in what happened with the Protestant Reformation, right? That this instantly fractured. And it fractured, what's very interesting, along cultural lines. Right, that my faith tradition was essentially started by, you could say like, middle class and upper middle class, Scottish people, where, okay, there's the Church of England, and well, the Church of England was essentially the Protestant Reformation for, upper class kind of like blue blood Brits. Mm-hmm. And you see that kind of like all over the place. And what you see in that is each one of those groups is so firmly convinced of their own complete and total rationality that I hate to say it, it's very much kind of this like, maybe there is a factor that I think we have to agree that culture plays a massive role in what we think is reasonable. And I think you've seen this if you've ever talked to someone older about young people, right? And there's a common refrain that like, why don't they have any common sense? And it's especially funny from people who are kind of alienated from their own parents, people who viewed their own parents as being kind of like stick in the mud, like kind of out of their own era. And you see this, and I noticed this, right? Because my parents are very, very classical Gen X, right? Core Gen X. My grandparents are classic baby boomers. And my parents will often say of people my age, like, oh, they just don't have any common sense. And I'll ask them kind of generally, well, like, well, okay, like, what do you think about your parents? And I'm like, oh, they're just so backwards. They're so, they're so completely like swept up in this, to them, largely illogical system of values. And it's one of those things to which, like, I think that the idea of neutral, impartial reason is a myth that we have to kind of get away from. And that's actually maybe a good way to kind of, package this last like 10, 20 minutes of conversation, is the idea that neutrality is sort of a myth. That the idea that you can have a system impartial to value, whether it be rationality, whether it be government,
yes,
is a lie. That there is a system of values driving. And effectively, I would argue that we're fighting over which system of values is at the wheel, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You see this a lot in the discussion right now between the right and the what's the lightning rod, James Lindsay's going after Christian nationalism right now, and he's formulated, I think convincingly. I don't know if I completely ascribe to it, but it is pretty convincing. He's proposing that this summer the dialectic is going to be between LGBTQ plus, what Blair White called the Wi-Fi password religion or whatever, and then Christian nationalism, and what power is going to do, or for intents purposes, we'll just call it power. What power is going to do is pit the rainbow people against the Christian nationalists, and the Christian nationalists are going to lose because homophobia is it's already a losing position. Like the ratchet has already gone so far past gay marriage that there's no bringing that back. Or with Yarvin, and I'm kind of regurgitating a thread by Yoram Hazony, who's critiquing James Lindsay. Oh shoot, I just lost the thread. Yeah, Yarvin last year wrote an article about the hobbits and the dark elves and the light elves, and that the hobbits, being the Christian nationalists, being just the maybe the centrists, the grill happy, reasonably Second Amendment happy, reasonably liberal people, they're hobbits, and they need to just let power do its thing and not get in the way of power, because they're only ever going to lose. The Christians are only ever going to lose because they lost on a cultural level already. They're cringe. And they're even, for some reason, that progress pride flag is somehow less cringe than the Christian national flag. But so I'm bringing that up because you're talking about, if we are in a war of religion, I do think that power has consolidated itself around that progress flag, right? With the LGBT and the whatever those rainbow colors mean, and then whatever those racial things mean. It's basically the intersectional cheese gratering of human beings into all these different identity categories. That is the consolidation of power. It's super cringe. It doesn't really work. And if you look at at the rulers, the actual rulers, or at least the stewards of power, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, et cetera, they all are incredibly inept, and it's impossible not to see them as inept. It's impossible not to see this thing as entirely cringe. But if you go and you say, well, what's the alternative? What's the other religion? The biggest religion right now, or like the most consolidatory thing right now, would be some sort of Christian nationalism, but that doesn't quite work. Like I wouldn't want to live I would like to live in a Christian nation, but the Christian nation has to be properly construed as just being honest about our core values, and just being honest about those values being derived from Christianity. Now we can jigger around with how those values are communicated, what language those values are packaged in, with God and Christ and the resurrection and all that stuff. Those there's wiggle room for the symbolism for me. But if we just admitted that, the Christian value system is what caused us to work as well as we did. So let's just be honest about that, and then strain that of both the symbolism from the right and the symbolism from the left. Maybe this is a pipe dream. Maybe this is my classical liberalism coming through, that if you do strip the symbolism out of it, you don't have the same thing. You cannot communicate Christian values without Christian God. Maybe that's true. That's what I've been arguing earlier this week with the atheist, because he wants all those Christian values without the Christian aesthetics. And I'm like, well, can you actually do that? Can you actually do that? So I bring that up to question, from your point of view, is there an alternative religion? What is that alternative religion to the state religion? The state religion being intersectional pride stuff, rainbow stuff.
Well, this may surprise you. I actually find myself largely in agreement with you. I'm not a Christian nationalist in the most narrow sense, right? If you define Christian nationalism as, Stephen Wolfe, the people that agree with him, fine. I hope they win. I don't think they will, for any number of reasons. If that's your definition, I'm not. If you mean, should Christians count their Christian values as a contributing factor as to why they vote, of course I believe that, but it's defined by a million different people. I'm actually talking soon to John Harris, right, of Conversations That Matter, who's a guy in that sphere who I find quite interesting. But sorry, point being, so that's not my crowd, and I think that this is part of the problem that we find ourselves in, is that there really is no unified counter narrative.
Yeah, there's no unifying aesthetic.
And this is something that Rod Dreher, who I consider currently to be man, truly, cringe is not a good enough word for him, but he was actually right about this in the Benedict option, where he basically said, look, like, conservative religious people in America have to kind of wake up and realize, like, you are not in a culturally privileged position anymore. You are a minority. So you kind of have to start playing hardball and act like it, which I think is true. I also think that what we've seen in evangelical circles, which I am connected to, if not a member of, I know enough about it, is that essentially, one, there's already been a large amount of peace made with the state religion, that a lot of people have compromised. For instance, right, the Southern Baptist Convention right now is being rocked by a series of essentially like extremely pro-woke positions and ordinances. And you would assume, right, like, oh, Southern Baptists are incredibly conservative. And that's true. A lot of churches are moving away from the organization, but you have this problem, and which with conservative, religious America, that they have no leaders. They have no leadership class. It's all hobbits. And again, I don't necessarily love that Yarvin article, but he has a point, right? That there is no necessarily real conservative Christian intellectual elite. The best people you have, and I don't mean best as in like I like them the most, but the closest to power would be like, okay, you've got people like David French, who is he realistically a conservative Christian American? Like, I know he says he is, but he's essentially a Democrat, right? Yeah. Then you have, like I guess you could also say, well, someone like Jordan Peterson, he's not necessarily explicitly Christian, but he kind of, could kind of be construed as like a Christian elite. It's like, well, he's nowhere close to power. Like, he has influence, but like, he's not getting flown into the White House. And so what I see there is that I don't think there's a unified position that people can, kind of hold to kind of oppose this force. And really what I see is that the state religion is not sustainable, right? That the precepts of this religion are the very things that are kind of eroding its power. And so I don't necessarily like take any joy from looking at the system in which I live in and say like, well, it's not being driven well. It's not necessarily looking healthy. But I think that one of the things is that, there's not necessarily like a new religion waiting in the wings. It's not like this is first century Rome and like, okay, no one really believes paganism anymore, and there's Christianity waiting in the wings. Like, if there's something coming, I don't see it. Some people have said like maybe something like Duginism. I'm not necessarily super convinced by that, but I don't necessarily have an answer on that. I disagree with Lindsay's take that this summer will be the trans v Christian nationalism, kind of rumble. To me, I actually think that there's been sort of a signaling that the trans stuff is kind of being put back in the box for the moment being. Uh,
Hmm.
and I don't necessarily think that it's all going away. I'm getting the feeling that that part of the culture war is gotten too hot, and we'll kind of see a focus shift away from that, similar to how we saw a shift away from as explicit racial politics after the summer of Floyd, right?
Yeah.
Where it's still in the news,
Yeah.
but I feel like there was very much a tone shift from
Yeah.
racial politics to gender politics.
Yes.
I could be wrong in that. I also think that the other problem with Lindsay is that Lindsay is an out and about. He's an out and out atheist, and so I think that that colors his perception of things. And going back to what I said about how a lot of evangelicals have already compromised, a lot of people have already compromised, right? And those denominations, those groups that compromise, even if they don't die out now, they die off hard after a generation. I was speaking to a Catholic, in my community, and he basically described what happened to the Catholic Church, right? Where in the 60s there was this kind of like wave of liberation theology where they were kind of like half Catholic, half Marxist, and kind of a cluster around that. And so what the problem is that those priests, right, are now baby boomers to silent generation, are dying off. And the people who followed them in an ideological sense, they didn't stay being kind of like 1960s half Marxist, half Catholics. They went full Marxist.
Yeah,
they left. They stopped being Christian. And so that's what tends to happen in these organizations like mainline Protestant Christianity in America, right? That they compromised on social issues a long time ago. The Presbyterian Church, right, is a great example. They compromised on gay marriage in the mid 2000s. They started ordaining gay ministers, and what happened is they're dying because, again, right, that mechanism where their ideological successors, they just keep going. And so what I think will happen is that probably conservative Christians will just become a sizable minority, but I don't think that minority is necessarily going anywhere, because there comes a certain point at which it's like, well, if you didn't compromise on that, you're probably not compromising on anything. And I'm not necessarily going to say I think it's going to be 50% or 20% or 10% even of current capacity, but I do think there will be a certain percentage of hardliners that just never go away.
Yeah.
I think that you've seen that in any religious community, that there are some people who are just, kind of like sticking it out. But I do think that, even in the South, right? I live in the South. I love it here, but cultural Christianity is on its way out, and you even see this in kind of the campaign of Donald Trump, right? That obviously, like, he kind of plays lip service to kind of Bible Belt America, right? But I mean, let's be honest, right? No one really believes he cares. He's a New York billionaire.
Yeah.
He's had like 6 or 7 divorces. It's very obvious that that's not necessarily where even the second string American political party is anywhere interested in. It's a minority. It's going to be a significant minority in America, even as demographics change. But to me, I think that Christian nationalism, much like the moral majority, I view as kind of a flash in the pan. I wish I was wrong. I'd like for them to win, but I don't see it happening.
It just doesn't have the aesthetic. It just does. I mean, and without the aesthetic, it doesn't have power.
Well, I think without an elite class, there's no power. When you look at the people doing this, right? Like, you have some upper middle class people, maybe, but like, are there Christian nationalists at Harvard? Are there Christian nationalists at the State Department? No. I don't see so, and to me, right, I don't believe that you can take, an on the ground movement, especially a minority on the ground movement with no upper level support, and turn that into anything, especially when the support among most people is relatively tepid. It's not like there's a Baptist Taliban out there who's willing to, walk into downtown DC and blow themselves up. Right. Yeah. And again, I'm not saying this punitively, right? Like, these are my people, but to me, I view it as kind of, tilting at windmills. And I don't mean to take away their wins, right? Like, obviously the Budweiser thing is something, but I think that going from Budweiser stock went down an appreciable amount to now there's, now we're in The Handmaid's Tale, Stephen Wolf, eternal Führer of America. Like, I just don't see that coming,
Yeah.
and I'm speaking hyperbolically, but you get my point.
Yeah. Yeah. So to kind of downscale, if you want, and adjust your answer to your comfortableness of this, you mentioned, or you've mentioned that you have a family, you want to start a family, maybe you have kids, maybe you want to start kids. And once you have that skin in the game, it kind of changes the landscape because you have to more or less intentionally understand that you want to create a human being. Like you have an oversized influence on your children for a very narrow point of time. You look at the culture, you look at power, you look at the landscape, and you have to kind of see your values that you want to instill, but you also have to instill the tools into the kid to adjust their values to their environment, right? So there has to be, you have to build in compromise to the kid, right? So that they can get ahead in life, so that they can flourish, they can be successful. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of man do you believe in? What kind of human being do you want to see in the world? Do you want to be in the world that you think, despite the political, but with the political in mind, that's possible right now? A very broad question.
No, this is actually to me really what I view as kind of the most important thing that I do on the internet, right? Because it's part of the reason that I think it's really funny that I've had people in my personal life like absolutely lose their minds about my online political work, is because, to be honest, like I'm really a quietist. Like I don't vote. I don't go to protests. I think that all your listeners should not go to protests. Especially if you're protesting anything that's actually like unpopular, right? But what I do believe is essentially that like the ideas being promoted at kind of a national level, at a a citywide level, are not good. And there's only so many bad decisions you can make before they start to catch up to you.
Yeah.
And I think that in America, we have an astounding amount of capital to burn through before things go bad.
Unfortunately,
right? Like
yeah.
I'm not saying that, it's Mad Max is around the corner. But what I am saying, right, is that when you have made a series of essentially short-term biased decisions, right? Like I can get more power now at the cost of some consequence in the future, right? Eventually those notes come due. And so I think that we're already kind of seeing that happen, right? With more and more countries saying like, hey, I feel a little bit shaky about, signing on to the US dollar. Like I'm looking for alternatives. And that's, I think, a broader symptom. And so you're like, all right, well, okay. I look at, and I've said this, like even to you, right? That I want to, kind of like start a family, right? That's something I've been working to. Well, how do you do that deliberately if you truly are convinced that, things might be not even ending, that the world is just going to get worse, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't even see that as unprecedented. Like there's been a major economic depression twice within the last 100 years. Like we could have another one, not necessarily like eating corpses in the street, but like things can get kind of unpleasant. Yeah. And so in doing that, right, it's like, okay, well, like what is within my sphere of control? What can I do? And to me, the thing that I've been prioritizing, and a lot of my friends have been prioritizing, is essentially taking online relationships and turning them into real relationships.
Okay.
Taking this truth, right, this thread that we're pulling at, and saying like, okay, well, it's all fine and dandy, that democracy is a lie or whatever. Like, why does that matter to me, right? And so, to me, right, when I look at like where are the exciting things, it's building these kind of intentional communities. Resisting the atomizing pull of the internet, of modernity, and realizing, right, that you were going to have to make sacrifices. So you bring up, right, raising your kids to compromise with modernity. And there's a certain amount of that which has to be done. If you raise up your kid, and essentially only allow them to like churn, raw milk into butter, right, they're going to have a hell of a time trying to get through high school. But if you say like, all right, like these are my values, this is what I want to do. If you truly believe that, right, to paraphrase Jordan Peterson, if you truly believe that God is real, well, then act like it. So I'll use my own life, for example, right? I went to XYZ big city to make XYZ money at XYZ corporation, right?
Okay.
Big city, big job. But that's an atomized position, right? You have no community. You're separated from the people you love. No one around me agreed with me. And it's like, all right, well, if I truly believe that, these transcendental human values are more important than me making extra money, or me being a little bit more comfortable living in the kind of place that I aspired to, kind of getting climbing up higher on the social ladder than my parents or my grandparents did, I might have to sacrifice that. And I think that the promise, kind of like the implicit cultural promise that you can always do better and better and better than the people before you, that was viewed as an eternal trend, like something you could just do for 10,000 years. It'll just keep going and going. Everything will get better.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to kind of examine that really honestly and say like, okay, well, if that's not a possibility, right? If I'm either going to stagnate, and I think a lot of us have seen that when it comes to the wealth of, previous generations, right? Like, well, then we're going to have to start one, making cuts, and two, preparing for helping our kids out more than we were helped out.
Yeah.
Because the kind of like rising tide that raised everyone, well, that either seems to be petering out or it already has. And so that's a long-winded way to say that essentially like what I plan to do and what I have been doing, I've met a lot of people in my community, through this podcast, I've met a lot of other, creators and have kind of, built things with them, is to basically say like, all right, like the internet is a tool. The internet is not an end, that we're not essentially going to win the internet, get X+1 number of subscribers, you get a gold plaque on the wall. That's not the point. The point is essentially to say like, all right, like we're a minority. Not a lot of people think like you think or think like I think. And how are you going to take this kind of like diaspora of people who agree with me and say like, all right, well, like, how do we turn that into something real and physical, where we can actually make a real community where I don't have to worry about the fact that, my kids would be raised to hate me. Because let's be honest, right? Like that's a distinct possibility if you don't play the game deliberately. And I think that that's something else that, needs to be done, right? Is that the kind of like well-traveled path of just go along to get along, just like let society, run its course, I'll follow it, I think is no longer really a responsible play. It's not a good option anymore. And so if you're playing the game deliberately, right, this goes back to that idea of examining every premise, right? You're like, okay, well, like I can no longer afford to outsource my opinions on certain things. I can no longer afford to outsource everything. I'm going to have to do some things myself. I'm going to have to make sacrifices. And so I guess that's the direction that I've kind of gone in. And a lot of people I consider my friends and, people I consider influences of mine have kind of been going in that same direction, of taking this kind of like idea space, this disembodied, internet community and turning it into something, real and physical that you can touch, that you can say like, oh, I know Harvey Wallbanger, I know XYZ. He's my friend. I can call on him, and I can trust him because we have ideas in common. He's part of my religion, and in that case, literally. So anyway, that's kind of the direction that I've been going in. And it's part of the reason, right, that look, like I love doing this. I enjoy talking to people on the internet, but I don't do it to talk to more people on the internet, right? I do it because if you believe, right, that there's a correlation between, your alignment to the truth, right? How true your guiding principles are and how, your life turns out, right? Then this is a serious business. Like I believe, if you believe, right, that if you think that, men and women are interchangeable, that like ultimate leveling of all, human structures is the end goal. Like if you believe that, you act on that, that's going to radically shape your life. I would argue negatively. And so essentially, I guess that's the project, right? Of discerning truth. And then on the other end, like, turning that into something concrete and real.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Does it not? Does it not answer your question? So speaking tangibly, I've been told by, I'll call her a close friend, that I need to write a book. She's like, you have to write a book. Like you've been doing this for 6 years. That's the next step. You need to write a book, and then you can promote the book, and then you can be somebody. You need to you need to become more substantial. You need to become more real. And I agree with her, so I'm trying to think, well, what's the book? What is the book? So I'm kind of like trying to think about what I would have to give to other people that would be useful, entertaining, and would, reflect back on me, that it would just increase my value in the world. So I'm wondering, this internet thing, podcasting, it's the beginning of something. It's a gateway to something else. Do you perceive yourself becoming someone? And who do you see? Do you see the outline of who you're going to become as a figure? right? And I don't mean just like in an influencer cheap way, but like in a real substantial way. Like you're becoming a man. Like how old are you? You're in your 20s or 30s?
I turn 24 tomorrow.
Jesus Christ, you're so young. Um, so I guess like there's the horizon. Like you have 20 years, 40 years, 60 years to go along that developmental arc. So I'm wondering, do you feel that the ideas that you're engaging with are concretizing in some way? You say doing something real. I'm like, do you want to write a book? Do you have the beginnings of a philosophy, the beginnings of a like an articulation of the wisdom or the word that animates you that you want to put forth? Do you have the beginnings of that, the shape of that?
So yeah, this is actually, and you brought up, at the very beginning of this interview that you kind of periodically, yearly, re-examine, why you're doing what you're doing. And I have kind of a similar thing. I've been on the internet for, much less time than you are, but every couple of weeks kind of have this thought, right? Which is like, why am I doing this? And to me, right, I realize I am young. And it's part of the reason that I'm hesitant to give out definitive advice because it's like, well, why the hell should you listen to me? I don't know what I'm doing, which is true. But there's something that I feel that I am sort of a conduit for ideas bigger than me. That when I'm saying something, I'm not speaking with my own voice. I'm kind of channeling these ideas from this rich tapestry, this rich kind of like tradition of thought. And so in one way, it's like, well, you could say like, well, how do you want to die? Is a very good way to say like, well, what kind of man do you want to become?
Yeah.
And to me, right, I think that, Aristotle answered this pretty well, right? Nicomachean Ethics, the book he wrote, allegedly, right, for his son, where he basically says like, well, what is a good death? And he says like a good death is to be, on your estate, surrounded by your family, dying peacefully. And okay, there's some things to unpack about that because you can say like, well, that's, there's that crystallized moment, but what does that mean? Well, you have an estate, you have a family, you have a community that cares about you. That means one, you have invested, you have created something that outlasts you, something that you can use to build for your family, to, provide for them. And I think that might be a good way to look at it. I'm nowhere near, the point in my life where I want to write a book for any number of reasons. But the reason you write a book and the reason you make an estate or you create an estate are kind of similar, right? Much like the king we were talking about earlier when it came to politics, right? That there is an obligation you have to the future, that you aren't just you, that the purpose of your life is not merely to maximize your own personal enjoyment, the amount of, serotonin that floods your lizard brain. You have a duty, right? There's a chain before you and after you. And maybe that idea of a tapestry is a useful one because I think that, and people like Peterson were very good at pointing this out, that, very much what we're suffering right now is a crisis of meaning. That people are like, well, why do I exist? We live in societies where it's very difficult to answer the question, why does this society exist? And I think that if you're like, all right, well, we want to recapture that, we want to recapture that ability to answer the question, why am I here? And I think that again, and I'll go back to Peterson because he's impactful to me and many others, right? The answer to that is, well, give yourself to something. Yeah. Create obligations for yourself. And okay, then we look at, well, what historically has fulfilled that niche. What historically have greater men than me, given themselves over to, right? And you find that okay, there's this kind of hierarchy. These fealties you owe, to adopt kind of a feudal stance, right? On the top, right? You owe your responsibilities to your creator, to God, a sub in, whichever, religion of your own choice, right? Yes. And then below that, right, you have your obligations to authority. You have your obligations to, your family. And within that, right, that same pattern of this chain, to adopt a common phrase, the chain of being, right, is to kind of give yourself back that purpose. And so I feel incredibly lucky because I'm not a particularly talented, writer. I'm not, a particularly original thinker when it comes to these. I'm essentially just remixing the thoughts of others. But I have meaning. I know what I'm supposed to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean on like a moment to moment, like, well, okay, like what should I do in the next hour? But I have a confident vision of like, well, what is a good man? It's the Aristotelian vision. It's this vision that we see throughout, kind of like the Western canon of good men. And it's like, okay, well, I want to be that. I don't necessarily know how on a moment to moment basis, but I feel like we can do it. And it's part of the reason that I'm interested in discussing these ideas, right? Is it's like, okay, well, what is it to be a good man? What is it to live a good life? And obviously, it's fun to talk politics because you're kind of figuring out the system in which you live. You're mapping the confines of the pool that you're swimming in. But within that, what really is up to you is like, well, how can you operate within those constraints? And so it's like, okay, well, going back to the idea of the estate, it's like, okay, I think that a lot of us feel like our predecessors didn't leave us with much. We feel like the institutions were allowed to die. A lot of social capital was burnt up. And you see this especially in the European context with pensions very directly, right? Mm-hmm. The societies are being choked out by old people who are just like cramming or like squeezing every little bit of blood they can from the stone, impoverishing their children. And we see that as wrong. But we got to understand that there's a obligation you owe both directions. And while that the other end of the bargain hasn't been held up, it's like, well, what makes it better? You saying, well, fine, if that's not being held up, then I'm not going to do it either. Or saying like, all right, the chain's been broken. It's kind of dangling. And like, all right, it might not be the best link. It might be a little bit, wonky. It might be a little bit half-assed, but at least there's another link in the chain. And to me, I guess that kind of like crisis for meaning is solved by, resuming the work on the chain, resuming your place in the tapestry. And certainly, right, I'm not going to deny it's not necessarily the sexiest thing. It's not the most fun. As someone who's recently married, I am feeling the constraints of tying yourself into something bigger than yourself. But that's good. You need that. You need restraint, not you personally, obviously, but you need to be obligated because otherwise, right, you're at the end of your life and far from being, the rich man on his estate surrounded by children, kind of a pillar of your community, dying as, we all do, right? You're the baby boomer, right? Who never had kids, who had a ton of fun in the 70s. And I've met this guy. I met Mark, one of my old friends, and he died at 73. And there were 3 people with him. One of them was a guy who used to work for him. The other one was the guy who drove the tow truck that he knew, and a doctor. That's it. Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, well, he probably had more dopamine in his life than I did. He would tell me these wild stories about parties he went to, celebrities he hung out with. He was a very wealthy man. But I mean, how long does that last for? Right? Like if you're the 60-year-old man and you're still trying to live it up, you're at the club trying to pick up, 25-year-old sorority or 25-year-old, recent college grads, right? It's like, is that a life you want to live? And so my point in this is not just to moralize. My point in this is to say like, well, the reason we're talking about these ideas is because they matter, and they matter on an interpersonal level. And so if there is to be meaning found in life, right, it isn't to be found in that kind of like indexing yourself to these higher ideas. So that's sort of where I've found myself.
Yeah. Yeah. In your explorations of the sphere that you're in, and I just like left and right doesn't really make sense so much as there's left and not left, more or less. Mm-hmm. There's people heading in the direction of the left and progress and the government and power. And then there's people who are more or less resisting that, or like, then they get further and further away from that. But so you're kind of mapping the discourse, like a realm of discourse. What are like the biggest distractions in your sphere and in the right? What are the biggest hangups or the ways that they're shooting themselves in the foot or getting distracted in one way or another, or something that you just dislike, that you're like, that's dumb, and I don't want you to call out anybody by name or get yourself in trouble. I'm just interested in seeing like how you're editing that or how you want to resist and purify that of certain things that you think are inefficient distractions.
No, definitely. So one of the most common things, right, is that any like political subculture is infamous for infighting, right? And there's a lot of infighting on the right that I view as largely a complete and total waste of time.
So what is it? What is it like that infighting? Where does it arise? What tensions does that bring to light?
So some of it, right, which is that there's there's energy in the e-right sphere, right? A good example of this is NatCon in the UK, right? Where you have high-ranking officials in the British government talking next to people like Alex Kashuda, right? Which is kind of an odd thing. But there is energy in this sphere. Kashuda is a great example, right? She's done quite well for herself. She, gets a large amount of viewership. And with that, we'll just use to like an internet term, with clout comes something to compete for, right? When it's a couple guys on an internet forum, right? There's no real incentive to like start stupid drama because it doesn't matter. You're talking to an audience of 12. Obviously, there's always interpersonal fighting, but there is in any internet community, there is an incentive to causing a fight, right? Because it draws eyes to you. And so the distributist, a friend of mine calls a lot of these people essentially like internet psychos, people who essentially just cause drama to promote themselves, and obviously you can probably think of any number of people who do that. So that's a part of it. And I would argue that's kind of endemic to the internet in general. It's not specific. So that's one
human
part
nature. Yeah.
Another one is this kind of deep fissure that runs through the right. And this goes back for arguably the whole 20th century between what we can broadly describe as the Christian right, who has a Christian system of values, even if they're not explicitly Christian, and the Nietzscheans, right? The people who basically believe like, oh, might is right. There's something, part of what we are facing, part of the problems with, modern philosophy, modern system of values is that it is derived from Christianity, right? And that is I would argue that is a bridge that can never be crossed. There's fundamental disagreement. But what I will say is that there's the kind of continual sniping back and forth. So the best example, right, is that recently, and I'm only referencing this because it's the example that springs out to me. This is an argument that effectively pops up roughly every 3 months, and it's a colossal waste of time. And so you'll notice I never participate in it because it's a colossal waste of time. But roughly 6 months ago, Matt Walsh, right, a conservative Catholic who works for the Daily Wire, made some comment about the fact that all a man ever wants is to come home and be, welcomed by his kid. The very classic Norman Rockwell.
Yeah, his wife's got his food on the table and takes off his shoes and gives him a pipe or whatever. Yeah.
And obviously, okay, that sounds pleasant, but is that really like all you can hope for? Like, I'll be honest, like I like family life. I've spoken very positively of it, but like, okay, come on. Like, that's not everything you could hope for. The idea that that's the whole end of civilization, I would argue, is kind of limited. And you get just inundated with people like dunking on him, making fun of him, basically saying like, oh, you are, a slave to women, posting pictures of the woman of Wallendorf, right? This fat fertility goddess, like, oh, you're just bowing down to that. And obviously some of that's funny, right? Because that is, let's be honest, it's a little bit pathetic. It's a little bit, kind of like overly harping on it. But this then becomes, a weeks long feud about like, oh, if you want a family, you're weak, you're settling for something lesser. You should be. And again, I've read Nietzsche. I'm not a Nietzschean. I'm not trying to denigrate this position, but there is this occupied by certain people that essentially like the true masculine way to, be as a man is to, conquer lots of women, be, this kind of like Nietzschean, like I am for myself. I have transcended kind of your lesser bourgeoisie values of X, Y, and Z. And I don't agree with that, right? And
it becomes really, really gay the further they bend that horseshoe too. Super masculine, and then you're like, okay.
Well, there's a reason that homo-fash is very much a real thing. But there's one argument about the internet etymology of that. It's homosexual fascists, right? They do exist. But my point is, right, that is a bridge that cannot be crossed on a certain level, right? That even people like Jonathan Bowden, who, while he's dead, I owe a great deal amount to when it comes to, his personal philosophy. He was an avowed pagan. He basically viewed the pagan values of, in his case, I believe like ancient Britain or ancient Rome are superior to Christian values. People like the French New Right, of kind of the 70s, 60s and 70s are another kind of group associated with that. And so that is something that can never be bridged, really. That is an ideological fissure. I'm not necessarily saying everyone paper over that and pretend it's not there, but this kind of like recycled dialogue, because that specific example I said about Matt Walsh, that has been repeated probably 36 times, just over and over and over again. We're just doing it essentially ad nauseum because it drives internet engagement. It's a good way to get 5,000 extra Twitter followers or to get a certain like amount of clout. And so that goes back to, why are you on the internet? And I believe that there is a certain number of people, internet psychos included, who are essentially on the internet and on the right because it's fun, because it's a good way to activate, that kind of lizard brain. And don't get me wrong, like I wouldn't do this if I didn't enjoy it. It's not if you actually like average out what I make from each video versus how much work that goes into it, it's not worth it. I should just be flipping burgers. But, I'm not going to deny that I enjoy it. But that said, like, it is by virtue of being on the internet kind of poisoned by the incentives of being on the internet, right? Which is to grow your audience, to, increase the amount of eyes on you. And I think that that's something that is kind of on one level poisoning the discourse. If you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah. That's what I'm kind of thinking. That's what the book I kind of want to write is about how to be a human being and use the internet and not have the internet use you, to kind of understand what it is, to really kind of understand what it is, and to carve out like a moral vector to it, if that's the right phrase. Anyway, so that's just what I'm thinking about, because that's what I've been dealing with in the last 6 years. So
that would be a very interesting, like, I'll put it this way, I'd read that book, because it's something that I think that everyone who interacts with the internet, who makes, content, kind of has to deal with, especially if a certain amount of your online content is especially like go touch grass, I realize there's some irony when you are saying that via an anonymous internet podcast, so it's a tension that I feel.
Yeah. So no books coming out. But you have this podcast. What could you describe to my audience, like your schedule and like what you've been doing and where you think you're headed with this?
Yeah, sure. So I am somewhat unused to being interviewed, right? I hold an hour-long interview show roughly every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, and I talk with interesting people, normally on the right, because that's who my friends are. I have spoken to people like Academic Agent, to Charles Haywood, figures like that in what I consider kind of like the post-liberal right. The questions that I kind of strive to, address are basically like, well, what is the system in which we find ourselves? How did we get here? And then also like, well, how ought we to act? And so when it comes up to my, my schedule coming up, I've said that I will have, John Harris, the guy at Conversations That Matter, he's going to be appearing on my podcast. I have, the internet figure Thomas777. He and I are quite good friends. He appears on my podcast.
What's his deal? He's kind of spooky.
He's an interesting guy. I won't speak for Thomas.
Okay.
But Thomas is a well,
you guys are friends,
historian.
So I don't expect you to.
He's a historian. He's a science fiction author, and he's an incredibly original thinker. Yeah. I've never met anyone like Thomas. I like Thomas enough. I invited him to my wedding. He's a true friend of mine. I'm looking when I have a very few things on my desk. One of them is a note from Thomas, right? He's a true friend of mine. Point is, he's a wide variety of, eccentric and eclectic thinkers. Yeah. My format is simple. I am not the person to come up with it. It's an hour-long casual interview show. Imagine exactly 20 to 30% of what this interview was. That's what my show is, about that length. And I really have enjoyed it. And when I see like what questions am I looking at upcoming, the kind of two big issues that I'm tackling are one, and I realize this is a little bit controversial, is I'm going through kind of a honest look at slavery as kind of an international institution, like what was slavery globally? And then also kind of directly, like what was slavery like in the US? Again, I have two people coming on to talk about that. Both are, experts. I'm also got a few people from kind of the more directly Christian nationalist sphere that I'm in talks with, because those are two, one obviously historical, one more practical, issues that I'm interested in, right? Kind of pulling more strings and seeing where they lead. And so that's where I am. That's what I've been doing. And thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for joining me. One last question, just because I like to throw out, what do you do that's not related to the internet that just gives you a lot of joy? Like what's your cool little dorkiest hobby, if you don't mind sharing that?
Oh, this is so several things, which is one, I truly love reading. I read as much as I can,
Hmm.
not just, things related to politics, although I'll admit that takes a lot of my time. And then the other person is I'm an inveterate project starter. So I've said before, I love, working on cars and doing just like any number of, assembling and disassembling different items.
Hmm.
It's something that I take a lot of solace, and it's nice to have something to just completely devote yourself to that
Yeah.
requires no thought, because it's sometimes hard to get your brain to turn off. And I'm sure you've had this experience where, you've read so much, you've listened so much that you feel like you almost have no space left for your own thoughts.
Hmm.
And so the ability to kind of like forcefully, reset and kind of devote
Hmm.
yourself to a repetitive manual task, I think is ideal.
Excellent. Jay, you're a great guest. I'm going to have you back on. And I'm really excited that my audience gets more of you, because I did cross post our previous interview and people said, like, who's interviewing who? And I feel like we have a really good rapport and dialogue. So it's great to have you.
Yeah,
I hope
thank you
to
so
have you
much,
again.
Benjamin.
So
I really appreciated the opportunity.
absolutely. And finish the recording. And wait, what?